Hello to our two participants. Hopefully, a couple more will file in as we go. Definitely had a couple more registered, but all good. For those of you who don't know, I'm Tom Manowitz. I am the college division manager at USA Ultimate. Below me, on the right side of the screen, is Amy Hudson. She is the National Developmental College Coordinator. Uh, she is responsible for a lot of our star programming and working with brand new teams to getting them set up for the college season, and responsible for this star series. And then, of course, we have on the left side Mitch Dengler, who is the head observer, general good person, and our lead on this webinar. So, Mitch, I am going to stop talking and let you take over.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the introduction. I don't know if I'm generally a good guy, but I hope I at least fit that. I'm going to go through. I'm basically as Tom said, I'm the National Observer Director for USA Ultimate. I'm going to be talking about playing with observers for today. So hopefully this webinar will give you some good information about what it's like to play with observers, what to expect, what not to expect, and kind of go over some of the stuff that's involved in that. So basically, what we're going to talk about is the observer roles, basically all the stuff, all the things that observers do. I'm going to talk about active calls in detail, and then go over inactive calls and arbitration of those calls. Typical point with observers, misconduct system, and Q&A. So happy to answer anybody's questions at the end of this. I should note that the primary focus of this is for playing with observers, not like philosophy of the program, where the program's going and whatnot. But this is just kind of what the state is of observing now. So basically, in an observed game, we're there to maintain spirit of the game. We're not there to take over your game. So we kind of keep the game moving. We do this by basically active calls, which include offsides, line calls, and time limits. Then we also arbitrate disputed calls when asked for the inactive calls, and we also implement the misconduct system. What we don't do is take control of the game from the players. The game still belongs to you. We're not there to try to decide the outcome of the game or take it over from you or make all the subjective calls in the game or render justice. We're not there to make makeup calls if we see stuff going wrong that really should go the other way, and it's just how teams are playing within limits. We're also not there to do uniform enforcement. So when you get to nationals, if you see the other team not wearing things the way you think, then that's a question for USA Ultimate, not for the observers in the game. We might help you find USA Ultimate, but that's not our job to enforce that. And we're also not there to enforce tournament format. So a lot of people kind of ask observers like, "Hey, shouldn't it be this? Shouldn't it be this? Do we have to play this game?" Like, that's generally not what we're there for. We might be able to help you out without some general knowledge, but not why we're there. But the key is the game still belongs to the players. So active calls. The first one I'm going to talk about is offsides. It's kind of the most common one, and it's very different than non-observed games. Kind of make the joke that in unobserved games, 99% of pulls teams are offsides, and with observed games, 99% of pulls are done onside. So basically, the members of the receiving team have to be in contact with the line at all times until the pull goes up once they've signaled readiness. So it doesn't have to be their foot, but usually that's what we say. So we tell players 1 foot on the line. For the pulling team, they just have to have their feet behind the line at the time the pull is released. So if their body or their hands or their head or whatever is across the line, but their feet are still behind their line, they're good. If the feet are on the line, that's technically offsides. Signaled. So if your team is offsides, the observer at your end is going to raise 2 arms crossed over the top of their head and yell offsides. You can't decline offside. So if the pull's terrible and you're with the receiving team, you can't say, "Well, just ignore that." Once offside is called, then you got to accept it. The first instance is just a warning, and you have a repull. After the first instance for a team, then there is an actual penalty. So if the offense is offsides, then basically you begin in the center of the end zone that you're defending, and you set up kind of like out of a timeout, and the defense checks the disc in, and you play from there. If the defense is offside, which is by far the more common one, then the offense is going to begin with the disc at midfield. So in both cases, remember, the offense sets up, and then the defense matches up and checks in. Kind of the pro tip is don't worry about looking at the observer at every pull to see if they're offsides. If just run hard on the pull, focus on the disc and where you need to go on offense on if you're with the receiving team, and if you're offsides, we'll yell it, we'll tell you. So that's pretty straightforward. Another thing that's pretty straightforward that we take care of for you is in and out of bounds, the line calls. So in and out of bounds, basically, is going to the hand signal is just one arm pointing either in or out. Observers are only going to signal generally if you make a catch within about 2 meters of the sideline, and we're not going to signal in if you catch it in the middle of the field. It's kind of a waste of time and draws attention away from people. Observers will also help mark where the disc goes out of bounds. Like if a pull rolls out of bounds or if a disc goes out of bounds on a turnover, we might throw a beanbag down on the sideline or go stand or throw a hat and mark where the disc went out of bounds. That's not like a binding thing in terms of we're not going to, if the thrower comes up and puts it in play 10 feet from where we're marking it or 10 yards, if nobody says anything, we're not going to stop play or enforce it because that's not an active call, but we're going to help direct to the right spot. So the defense needs to call this a violation if it happens. Do remember the perimeter line is out of bounds, so if your foot is on the line, you're out when you catch the disc. You have to be completely in bounds. Also, one thing to note is that force out fouls are actually active calls. So if you catch the disc and you're airborne and you contact an opposing player and that contact causes you to land out of bounds when you are going to land in bounds, then an observer will actively stop play and call a force out foul and rule you in. So in terms of line calls, remember up down is not active. So if a disc hits the ground inbounds and a catch is claimed, the observers will not call it down, but they will signal it in, even if they firmly believe that the disc was down. We have to wait until the defense calls the disc down. Also, keep in mind when the disc is caught near the sideline and you're on offense, just play like you're in bounds. I mean, if you know you're out of bounds, then you can put the disc down. But if it's really close, don't worry about stopping and looking back at the observer to see if you're in or out. Just play like you're in, and if you're out, we're going to yell and tell you to stop play, and then that'll save you a stall count or two. So just play like you're in until you hear that you're out. We also, in line calls, we cover in and out of the end zone. So it's signaled by 2 outstretched arms pointing at the center of the end zone. So if we're at the back line, we're going to be pointing forward. If we're at the front line, we're going to be pointing more towards the center of the end zone. Remember that the goal line is not part of the end zone. So if you catch the disc and you're contacting the goal line, you are not in the end zone. Force outs also apply to the end zone. So if you catch the disc and you're airborne and you're going to land in and contact from an opposing player causes you to land out of the end zone, we are going to call that force out and we're going to award you a goal. Kind of a common misunderstanding near the goal line is if you catch the disc short of the goal line and we call you not in and you're on the run and you catch it and momentum brings you into the end zone and you're kind of running at an angle relative to the goal line, when you come to a stop, what the rules say is just bring it to come straight up from there, come to the closest point on the goal line. So if it did bring you out of bounds, then you're going to go to the corner, but it's not. You don't have to go back to exactly where you crossed the line. It's relative to where you stopped. Again, remember up down is not active. So if we give the in and out of bound in the end zone signal, that doesn't necessarily mean we believe the disc was caught before it hit the ground. It just means that a catch has been claimed and it was in bounds. So we're going to give that in the end zone sign, and we're going to look around for down calls. Also, this is kind of the opposite of the sideline call. If you think you're in the end zone, don't act like you're in the end zone. Look to that observer and look for that in the end zone signal. Because if we don't signal you in, we don't think you're in, and you spike it, you've just turned the disc over. That's a live disc, so don't do that. Always check for the observer. In terms of a catch in the end zone, while we're on the subject, once a catch has been claimed and where the observer signals in the end zone, this is not a goal yet. Don't rush the field. Don't start your party quite yet. The downsfield observer is going to look and listen quickly for calls, and the trail observer is going to do the same thing. Maybe there's a travel or a stall at the throw that could negate that goal, or maybe there was a pick. So once the trail observer feels there's no call, that he's going to give the little mini goal. That's still not a goal. Once the downfield observer sees that and they also think that it's clear, then they're going to give the full arms up, and that's a goal, and then you can run onto the field and start your party. Time limits. That's the next thing we're going to talk about for active calls. So basically, time between points. The offense has 70 seconds to be on the line and signaling readiness. An early signal does not force an early pull. Also, understand that once you signal uh, readiness, then you can't put any more players on the line. So if you signal with 5 or 6 players on the line and you signal readiness, that's your line for the point. Hopefully, the observer is being proactive and telling you that you only have 6 players on the line or that you have 8. Then, if you have 8 in signal, we're going to tell you no, you haven't signaled yet. You need to get 1 player off. The defense has 90 seconds, so basically, or 20 seconds after the offense signals if the offense were to signal late. So whichever is greater to pull. If the team is a second or 2 late, we're not gonna enforce this to the second. We generally the rule of thumb is if the offense hasn't signaled yet and they're ready, we're going to signal for them. If they're not on the line, then we're going to give them a time violation. The pulling team, we say their pull has to be started by the time their run up for the pull has to be started by the time their 90 seconds has elapsed. If you're commonly a second or 2 late, we might remind you, hey, you need to speed up. Your first violation for time is a warning. Basically, we're just going to mark the warning, ask the offense for a readiness signal, and then once they've given a hand, we're going to immediately give the defense a 20-second warning to pull. Subsequent violations of this are treated like a timeout, so you'll be charged a timeout, and we'll give you the time as if you called it. If you don't have any timeouts left, then we're not going to treat it as a timeout. We're going to treat it as if you were offside. So just like depending on if you were offense or defense, what the penalty is. Very uncommon to see a time limit violation. Time following a pull or a turnover with the disc on the ground. So basically, when the pull hits the ground, or after every turnover where the disc hits the ground and comes to a stop, we're going to start counting the pre-stall for you. If the disc stops on the playing field proper, we're going to give you 10 seconds to put it in play. If it comes to rest out of bounds or completely in the end zone, then we're going to give you 20 to put it in play. If it's out of bounds and really far out of bounds, we'll use our judgment to give you more time. But if the disc is on the ground, on the playing field somewhere, it's either going to be 10 or 20. We're not going to ever give you more time for that. So what happens if you get to 0 and your pre-stall expires? Basically what that means is that if there's a marker within 3 meters of the thrower or where the thrower is going to put the disc in play, then they can start their stall. It doesn't matter if the thrower hasn't picked up the disc yet and you switch throwers, doesn't matter. They can just keep stalling. So timeouts. This is going to be, let's see, timeouts between points. So basically that's just going to add 70 seconds to the time between points. When you call the timeout, does not change how much time there is between points when you call a timeout. So if you wait 69 seconds on offense to call a timeout, or if you call a timeout as soon as the goal is scored, the offense has 140 total seconds from the time of the goal to signal readiness. The pulling team has 160 seconds, or 20 seconds from the time the offense signals if the offense is a little late signaling. So the biggest, in my opinion, the single biggest difference between unobserved and observed games is going to be timeouts during play. So if the disc is in play, offense calls timeout, they have 70 seconds to be stationary and let the defense match up. So in an unobserved game, that's usually about 2 or 3 minutes. This is going to go really quick. So basically at 40 seconds, we're going to tell the sideline players to clear the field, and then we're going to give 20 and 10-second warnings to the offense to freeze. Note that the thrower should pick up the disc before the end of the timeout, since the defense can tap it in immediately after that 70 seconds has expired. A lot of times you'll just see the thrower standing over the disc, and even after their time has expired. So the defense can tap it in whenever they want, so you probably want to have the disc in hand if they do it quickly. Once the offense is set, the defense has 20 seconds to match up and then restart play. Either after that 20 seconds for the defense, either team can check the disc in, and the other team cannot complain about it because they've been given plenty of time. So that's it for active calls. So inactive calls and arbitration. Basically any call that is not active. So any call that is not offsides, a time limit, or a line call is inactive. So stall, foul, pick, travel, up, down, double team, all the other violations. If a call is contested So all those calls you make yourself. We are not going to make those at any time for you. If a call is contested, any player involved in the call can request an observer ruling. Players should always discuss contested call with their opponents before going to the observer. We don't want to turn this into just like basically kind of referees for it, where call, nope, contest, I'm going to the observer, we rule, and then move on. We want the players to discuss, like Spirit of the Game describes. So once that has happened and a player has decided, yep, I want to go to the observer, then the observer is going to give a ruling. It doesn't have to be everybody has to agree upon it. Only one player. So if the offense wants to, if the offense wants to go to the observer and the defense doesn't want to go to the observer, the call is going to the observer because the offense wants it. So ruling. So if a ruling is requested and one or more of the observers are at least 90% sure of what happened, they're going to give a ruling. All rulings are final and should not be argued after they are given. And anytime an observer gives a ruling on an inactive call, play restarts with a check. So usually what you'll see like a foul that gets overruled and the defense celebrates and start running away with the disc on the ground, and then we're going to call you back. Nope, play's going to restart with a check. If a call is upheld, so anytime there's say a foul call and the foul is upheld, then we treat it like the call is uncontested. So if it's a receiving foul and we say, yep, it's a foul, then it's going to be the receiver's disc at the point of the foul. If the call is overruled, we're going to treat it like the player that made the call retracted it. So foul, observers will rule it. Well, we're going to treat it like, nope, I retracted. I didn't make that foul call. If the observer or observers are unsure of what happened, so if they just didn't have a good view of the play, or say one observer is pretty sure one thing happened and the other observer is pretty sure that the opposite happened, then they're going to basically call for a do-over, and they're going to treat it just as any normal contested call. Any call can be sent to the observer. So foul, violation, positioning after a call, where the disc is to be put in play, anything that can be basically argued about in a game of Ultimate, an observer can rule upon. So signaling rulings, basically, this is kind of a bit of a gray area sometimes for teams that aren't really familiar with observers. So anytime an observer is going to give a ruling, so if there's a foul call and they go to the observer, the first thing the observer is going to do before giving a ruling is they're going to tap their shoulders, and that's basically signaling the following call is the observer ruling. And so if they upheld the call, they're just going to give the signal for the call. So either like foul, travel, or pick, where they're going to put their hands on their hips, where you can't see in my webcam here. If they overrule the call, they're going to start with that same thing. They're going to start with that observer ruling signal, and then they're going to wipe away the call. And that's basically saying, nope, that call is overruled. So if you see an observer just come up and give a foul right away and give their 1 second stall at 1, that just means that they're just echoing the call by the player and it was uncontested. So if there's a foul call, you'll see the immediate foul call. The observer will run over and listen to happen. And if it's uncontested, the observer will just signal a foul coming in at 1 again, or no foul. And that if they ask for a ruling, they'll tap the shoulders. Common hand signals, you see them all the time for in between points and after turnovers is either 20 seconds or one fist for 10 seconds. So you just remember 10 seconds for each fist. Counting violations, so anything in terms of like a fast count or calling, they didn't drop their count after a double team or whatever. Anything that's involved a improper counting is basically tapping the wrist, like you're tapping a watch. Stall or time violation in between points. Travel, I think everybody understands that one from basketball. Pick, hands on the hips. Observer ruling, this is also what we use for injury. So if there's an injury, timeout, we'll kind of like an official's timeout in other sports. And then if they actually go to a full substitution, then we'll give the fingers back and forth. And that kind of helps the other team realize, okay, the team is subbing out, so we get to sub out as well. And then also if players agree to a contested call, like they don't send a call to an observer, they just want to play it as a contested call, then you'll see banging the fist together. Or if you see observer ruling, contest, that basically means that the observer isn't able to give a ruling. So then you can send the disc. Then you'll send the disc back, and you know that the observer wasn't able to give a ruling if it's preceded by the tapping the shoulders. So also we can talk about the misconduct system. This is something that it's not in the rule book, so players generally don't see it. They have to actually go to the website or read through the observer manual to see the player misconduct. But there is the full misconduct system in the rules section on the website now. So basically, the misconduct system kind of is separated into two overall arching categories. We have things that affect the presentation of the game, which are going to be covered by technical fouls. So that's going to be like if there's sideline encroachment. So if players are staying too close to the sidelines when they're the non-players who are not in the game, they're too close to the sidelines, or they're rushing the field after a goal before the goal signal is given, or if there's specific language rules like for nationals or the U.S. Open, you can't just generally swear. So those are all covered by technical fouls. So we give the exploding T to signify a technical foul. Generally, those are preceded by warnings, and we'll communicate to the coaches that those have been issued. So 3 technical fouls will result. The first 2 are warnings. The third one and subsequent will result in a yardage penalty, which I'll cover in a second. Everything else that it kind of affects the actual gameplay is basically lumped into what we call misconduct fouls. So there's team misconduct fouls, there's personal misconduct fouls, and then there's an ejection, which is kind of a combination of multiple misconduct fouls. So team misconduct fouls are signified with blue cards, kind of like a card like in soccer. You hold them up. I should have had some handy so I could hold them up here, but I don't. These are going to be like profanity directed towards an observer or towards an opponent. Reckless play, repetitive violations, or a single egregious violation. So like repeated bumping on the mark or pushing, kind of holding downfield. Taunting, spiking disc towards a player after a stoppage or after a goal, where you're not contacting the player, but you're taunting them with a spike. Those are all examples of team misconduct fouls. So 3 team misconduct fouls. The first 2 are warnings. The third and subsequent one will be also dealt with a yardage penalty. So a yardage penalty, basically, if it's against the defense, then the offense is going to have a choice of 3 options. They can either set up like out of a timeout with the disc at the attacking brick, no matter where the disc was, or they can set up in the middle of the field at their current yardage penalty. So say they're like at the 10-yard line, so they're beyond where the attacking brick would be. So it's actually you'd be moving backwards with that. So they want to just center it where it is. Both of those would, and also they could choose to stay in the current position with all the players where they are. So if, say, at the stoppage, one of their players is wide open in the end zone and they have an open throw, they don't want to give a matchup, so teams can just stay where they are. All 3 instances of those, the stall would come in at 1. If it's against the offense, then the defense chooses, and basically the offense is either going to get moved to the reverse brick, which is the center of the end zone that the offense is defending, with a new stall, or the defense can just say, leave the defense where they are, or leave the offense where they are, everybody stays put, and the stall is going to stay where they are. You would do this just like you're setting up out of a timeout. A more egregious version is the personal misconduct foul. So this is if a particularly bad, dangerous play, shoving a player, continued repetitive violations by a single player after they've been told not to, or particularly egregious profanity towards an observer or the opponent. That's displayed with a yellow card, just like in soccer. That counts as a TMF towards the yardage penalty. So if a team has two TMFs already, and they get and a player gets a yellow card on that team, that's for the purposes of the yardage penalties. That's the same as a third blue card, so they would get a yardage penalty there. This also carries a specific mark on that player. So if that player gets 2 PMFs in one game, then they are going to be disqualified for 2 halves. So if it happens in the first half of a game, they're going to be disqualified for the remainder of that game. If they are disqualified in the second half of the game, then they're going to be disqualified for the remainder of that game plus the first half of the next game. The only time that wouldn't apply is if it's the last game of the tournament. They're not going to carry over to the next tournament. 3 PMFs on one player over the course of a tournament would lead to an automatic suspension for the remainder of that tournament. And 5 PMFs on one team in a game is a forfeit, although I don't think we've ever seen that happen in the history of the misconduct system. So there's also an ejection in the misconduct system, which is basically 2 yellow cards, or a player can be ejected straight out for spiking the disc and actually hitting the opponent or purposely, or striking a player or shoving an official. All those would be immediate ejections. Same as a yellow card for a straight ejection counts as a TMF towards the yardage penalties, and it counts as 2 PMFs in regards to game forfeits. But again, that's really not that big of an issue. We don't have them that often. So that's all I have in terms of information for general playing with observers. If anyone has any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
Hey, Mitch, thank
If nobody in our participant list has any questions, I have a couple that I thought of, Mitch, that I
Go for it.
love to hear.
I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that I have skipped over.
So I guess my first question is sort of in your experience observing, what are usually the more contentious issues where observers get involved? Like, I mean, if it, sort of examples, but just sort of where are the areas where you've seen that either contentious or players have issues with observers, and how would you suggest avoiding those issues?
Okay, probably one of the most contentious thing is when a team is issued a TMF or a PMF for something that the other team has not called, a violation that they haven't called. Typically, we are not going to issue misconduct fouls for things that are not called by the opponent. So like if a team is constantly double teaming in a zone defense and the other team isn't calling double teams, generally we aren't going to issue a blue card for that. However, violations that are particularly egregious. So if a team is playing a really, really super tight cup, so they're only about, like, say, 4 feet away from the offense, from the thrower, that's something that is significantly changing the game, and particularly egregious fouls. There are times when, like, holding downfield against the cutters, the offense doesn't want to make that call, so they're not calling those fouls. But for particularly egregious instances, then we might issue blue cards without the other team calling that, and that does tend to rub the team on the receiving end of those misconduct fouls the wrong way. I do notice a question online there says, does the player misconduct system still apply in non-observed games? Currently, no. There is some talk about developing a misconduct system for unobserved games, but currently that's only implemented in observed games. So how long is halftime? Halftime in a standard game of Ultimate is 10 minutes, although there may be different if the particular tournament rules apply. Let's see, back to Tom's question. Other common areas, I would say setting up after a pick. There's a common misconception that if a pick happens, then you just catch up. You just start. You often see players start setting up right next to the player that they were guarding when they got picked. A lot of times a player will be like 7 feet away and they get picked, and then when they set up, they're like 2 feet away. It's like, understand that you only catch up your relative distance. So if a lot of times the other team will say, hey, he wasn't this close, and the pick player like, no, I was really close, and the observer like, well, you've asked me for where he should be here 7 feet away, and that tends to ruffle some feathers. Let's see here. The question says, could you explain the reverse brick again? So basically, a reverse brick is the middle of the end zone of defense. So if the offense is going, say left to right, so the offense, the end zone that they're defending is going to be on their left. It's the center of that end zone. So if you're offsides on offense, you're going to start basically 10 yards behind from where you were starting on the goal line when you were receiving the pull. So that is the reverse brick. So I'm trying to think of other contentious things that get people in trouble with observers. I know kind of observers of the whole language thing has kind of caused a confusion. A lot of teams think that, ever since some of the more talked about yardage penalties for language infractions at nationals, players are always like afraid, like, oh no, I swore around an observer, they're going to get in trouble. It's like, well, if you're not swearing at an opponent or at an observer, and there's no specific rules in that for that specific tournament, then we don't enforce general language. We very might use our judgment and see, like, hey, there's kids around. We're gonna, if you start dropping f-bombs left and right, we're gonna talk to you, even though there might not be specific rules in place for that specific tournament. So the question was, will TMS be issued against teams for inappropriate chants and language? Again, we're going to use our judgment. If a team is being particularly like degrading to their opponent, then yeah, that might be something that you get a TMF for. But we're not gonna, we're not gonna TMF you at a tournament without specific language rules for just saying a bad word during one of your cheers, unless it's specifically directed at another player. We try to encourage players, just like the USAU guidelines talk about how heckling should be done in a positive nature. It shouldn't be meant to degrade the other team. So we're gonna help you understand what that judgment entails. So hopefully that answers your question there.
Hey, Mitch. I've got a question. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about how, if there's a conflict on the field between, and a player doesn't agree with the observer ruling, what's the protocol in how someone should address that? Should they reach out to the observer at the end of the point, or is there a better time to do that?
That's a great question. Yeah, so what we don't want you to do is argue right at the time of the ruling, because all that's going to do is slow the game down and very well could get you issued a misconduct foul, which is only going to make the situation worse for you. What we do, we generally are not going to explain our calls at length. We might give a one sentence, in terms of like, hey, you hit his hand before you hit the disc on defense, but we're not going to go through this long-winded explanation of a call. We're more than happy to talk in between points at halftime or after a game. We might limit those conversations just because we have other things we need to take care of, but observers in general should be very open to a calm discussion about any sort of disagreement, or about the rules, about what happened, about what the observer saw. The observers are generally going to be pretty open. We're not just going to walk away from you. If you approach us and swearing at us or yelling at us, we're probably going to try to get you to calm down. And if you're not going to calm down, then we might walk away from you or use the misconduct system. If you do have a problem with an observer and they don't seem open to it, or you've had your discussion with them, you just kind of agreed to disagree, and you still want to like kind of move up the food chain there, you can reach out to the head observer at the tournament or the tournament director. You can certainly reach out to me online. I'm certainly available through Twitter. If you have my contact information, my personal contact information, you're more than welcome to use it. I'm very open to feedback about my own observing, about other observers, about the program in general. But yeah, arguing during the point is probably not going to be your best bet. Arguing or discussing calmly after the point and at halftime or after the game are going to be great instances to help everybody get on the same page and help clear up any misunderstandings.
Cool, thanks, Amy. Anyone else with any other questions?
Another thing I guess I'll talk about, since we have the time, is as observers, we don't want to see every call go to the observer. If you, as an opponent, kind of know in your heart that you shouldn't contest a call, but you think, well, maybe there's this off chance that it really wasn't the right call, I'm going to send it to the observer just on that off chance. You're not approaching things the way you should. We're not there to help you with the off chance and the small chances. We're there to make rulings on close calls when the teams want to go to the observer. Don't just don't get, like, if the disc is close to the ground and you didn't see it hit the ground, don't just guess and go, well, I'm going to call it down and go to the observer just in case. You should make calls based on what you see and what you know and what you believe, not just on the hopes that you might get a call go your way that you really didn't think was going to go in your way otherwise.
Mitch, if you're playing in a game, how many observers are you usually going to have? Right. I mean,
you're generally going to have 2 observers. If you're in a big showcase game, you might have 4 observers. So if you're in the finals and semis or finals of nationals, are always going to have 4 observers. Sometimes the finals for big tournaments will have 4 if the observers are available. Sometimes they'll be off doing other games. So that's a great question for regionals, because regionals might have, say, a region has 6 observers present, and the final, there's, say, 2 bids on one side of the bracket and 1 bid on the other on the other division. All 6 of those observers might be split evenly between 3 games. Whereas if you have 6 observers and each division has 1 bid, you might have 4 observers on one final and two observers on the other. You're very rarely going to have 1 observer. If we have an odd number of observers, sometimes we'll do the single observer system, but it's not a really good system. We don't get very good coverage. It's hard to see everything on the field. As an observer, it's really hard because it kind of reinforces bad habits, kind of puts you where you really wouldn't normally position as you would in the 2 observer system. So 95% of games that are observed with the 2 observer system. Probably the other 4% are observed with 4 observers, and then that 1% is done with 1 observer. So, so Flogan has asked what happens if the observers don't have a good perspective on a call and are asked for an opinion. So, as we said earlier, observers have to be 90% sure before they uphold or overrule a ruling on a call. So if there's say a foul call and one observer is really far away from it and the other observer was screened on the play, or they were watching the 2 arms together and coming together at the disc, and the player called foul because there was a bump at the hips and they didn't see that, or they were looking at the feet or to see if they were in bounds or whatever. If they're not 90% sure, then they're basically, when they're asked for a ruling, they're basically going to say, observer ruling, didn't see it, we're going to play this as a contest and we're going to send it back to the thrower. We work hard to position ourselves well where we're going to be able to see, but sometimes it just happens where you get screened, especially on an up-down call where the best perspective, like being in a good position to see the call, can change really quick with, say, a tip disc or whatever. So they say everyone's 90% sure is different. How are observers' integrity upheld in terms of maybe accidentally making the wrong call? 90% is definitely a subjective term. It's not like, it's a thing in your brain, but it's generally something that we talk about a lot during training, where you've got to be fairly certain. You've got to be very certain. It's very hard to be 100% sure, but I would say that everyone's 90% is going to be in the ballpark. They're going to be pretty close to each other. It's what we don't want people making calls on 50-50. We're like, it was close, I'm not sure. And that's why we have a kind of a high threshold there, and why they just get sent back in those cases. So,
another question I had, Mitch, is how often do you take team or player requests to have observers at a game, and does that change in regionals versus other tournament situations?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So in regular seasons, we try to regular season tournaments, we try to kind of spread the observers out. So every team is getting kind of at least an observed game if we have enough observers. A lot of times we may only have, like, say, 4 observers at a 20-team tournament, and there's just no way to get every team observed. But generally, if teams request observers, then we try to prioritize that. We do ask for at tournaments that they get those requests in early, especially like we'll have tournament directors send out a request early in the week so that we can show up with a schedule already made. At postseason tournaments, especially, basically elimination games are given priority over non-elimination games, if I can speak clearly. Any sort of game to go. So there might be a time where the finals of regionals is not a game to go. Both teams have already qualified for nationals, and there's, say, a 4th and 5th place game or a game leading up to a game to go that is an elimination game, and so you might actually have the finals of regionals not observed, where another game in the same if that same regionals is observed because it's a game to go or an elimination game. So those definitely get priority. Those tend to get priority during bracket play and regular season tournaments, but they very much get priority in postseason play.
Excellent. Anyone else? Otherwise, I think we can. That might be it. Unless Mitch, do you have any closing thoughts? Anything you would want to impart on someone who's playing their first game with an observer above anything else?
If you're playing your first game with observer, the biggest thing I can say is just relax. Like, don't worry about the observers. The observers are not there to make the game harder for you or catch you doing things like little things wrong here and there. If you're a good spirited player, you're really not going to notice a whole lot of difference. You're just going to notice that the game is moving a little quicker. Timeouts are going to move a lot faster, but overall, hopefully you're going to leave the game going, wow, that was really helpful in terms of we didn't have to watch the player's feet while we were making our defensive bid, because the observer's making that call for us, and we didn't have to worry about crazy, terrible calls or bad spirit. But honestly, just relax. The game's not going to be as different as you think it's going to be. It's actually going to be pretty much the same game, just move a little quicker.
Excellent. Well, if that's all we've got, I want to say, Mitch, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to try and get this up on YouTube as quickly as we can so teams can start using this as a resource and hear it from the head observer himself. Flogan's typing, but so we'll see. It's just a thank you. So thank you, Mitch.
You're quite welcome.
I'm going to end the recording and end the meeting. Thanks, everybody, for coming in.
Okay.
And then, Mitch, do you want to stick around just real quick at the end?
Sure, I can do that.
All right.